There we go. Morning, Tam.
Morning.
Oh, just as a thing, could you give me a slight introductory of what you are and who you are and the actual paganism you practice?
Right, my name is Tam Campbell. I was born in Dundee in 1949 and grew up as a Scots Catholic.
Oh, yes?
You, is it?
Yeah.
I grew up as a Scots Catholic and then went to Goldsmiths College and started to understand and see an alternative experience from the London scene. In that time, I studied a number of religious sort of groups, with a number of religious groups, including eventually a group that was one of the Wiccan groups in South East London. At that time it was still relatively new, especially to me, and I was able to learn from different angles, different people, and to grow in my belief.
Just as a point, could you explain what Wicca is?
Wicca is a mystery religion based on paganism and based on the worship of the gods. It says that magic is important, but it is the closeness towards the Godhead that I find most important within Wicca. Of course, everybody has their own individual opinion and ideas of Wicca, so it's a fairly eclectic thing in itself, but we base it on a training which includes a line back to a man called Gerald Gardner.
How far back does that go now?
Now it goes back to the early 50s, I would say. Maybe slightly earlier than that. Gardner was a colonial officer who retired to England.
So he's British?
Well, he's English, yeah, he's from England, and spent most of his working life in Malaya. Then he retired back with some money to England and found a group of people who were practicing a religion, a pagan religion, in the New Forest. Okay. That religion became expanded to his own view of what Wicca should be.
So is it a man's point of view of what religion should be, or a female? Is it actually what kind of...
Well, one of the main things that one is interested in is a man's point of view, but he had a number of females participants we call high priestesses, one of which, Doreen Valiente, heavily influenced from her position how Wicca itself evolved. And so we have this balance within it.
So were they equals in the actual religion, or was he the actual boss man in charge? To be descriptive or simplistic in it, is it a cult situation whereby there's an actual, what would I call it?
Magister.
There's a cult of personality.
Well, the religion itself isn't a cult of personality, but the size of the personality of Gerald Gardner was so large that it couldn't help but impress itself upon the people around him. So people still think of Gerald Gardner and one other, Alexander's, as being the big formers, but there were many other people who were developing it.
Okay, Alex. Before we jump on to Alexander's, indifference now, because Doreen Valiente you've just mentioned.
Yes.
Is there a cult of personality around Doreen Valiente as much as there would be of...
Not as much, but there is, for instance, there's the Doreen Valiente Society, people who actually come together to study the works and writings exclusively of Doreen Valiente. And so she's got a more formal thing, I think, than Gardner. Gardner's went into the background now more than Doreen Valiente is. And a lot of the stuff that one sees around is heavily influenced more by Doreen than by Gerald Gardner.
And what would you actually say the difference between Gardner's view of the way it should go as a religion to Doreen Valiente's is?
One of the most important ways is that Gardner, being essentially a Victorian policeman, colonial policeman, is quite rigid in some of his ideas about high magic and about how things should be written down and there's always a truth. Doreen was more of a poet. A lot of the stuff that she put in tended to be softer, more flexible and more amenable to the emotional side of worship rather than this idea of a series of rules that you've got to go by.
No, in looking at it, which would be more towards being a humanist, as in equality for all and the rest of it?
Heavily Doreen, I would say, very, very much more Doreen than Gerald. Gerald was into all this persons being born into her family's 20 generations, and he's also prime at enhancing the truth, shall we say.
So you're actually mentioning something there, but I don't have context as a person listening to it who has never heard about what this is. What do you mean by this lineage stuff?
Well, he would claim that a lot of stuff goes back to at least the Middle Ages, and he would claim that he had a special contact with that. Often when you
direct kind of lineage.
A direct thing, yeah. And when you look at it, it has more to do with the modern high magic developments coming from the Golden Dawn and Crowley. But Doreen, on the other hand, would see it as more of a poetry thing, and the actual prayers that she would write, the stuff she would do, was more romantic.
So just as a matter of interest, if you were to recommend a book on witchcraft, would you recommend Gardner's book, the guy who found it, or at least expounded more than anyone else at that time period? Or would you recommend Doreen Valiente's books?
Well, I would always recommend the very first book that I ever read on the subject, which was Doreen Valiente's book, Witchcraft for Tomorrow.
Why?
Because it's a very flowing, sympathetic, and I suppose more suitable for 21st century. She doesn't go into dogma. She doesn't go into things saying that, oh, people used to do this. It just talks really about the building of a magical relationship with the gods.
So the actual Gardner in difference?
I find him too strident in what he actually writes.
But strident, what you mean by strident?
This is what everybody used to do in the past. This is what I've discovered.
So dogmatic.
Quite dogmatic in comparison. Doreen is much more to do with the heart.
Okay, so she's actually in the spirit of the thing.
I would say she is the spirit of the thing in many ways, yes.
And more towards equality.
More heavily so, yeah.
So by equality at that time period, I'm actually, could you give me the time period roughly?
We're talking about Doreen coming in the mid-50s. She was active right up to the late 90s, the early 2000s when she died. I actually came across her, I think it must be about 2001 or maybe earlier than that, when she was doing a talk at a meeting I was at. So she was very active right to the end. Gardner, of course, was earlier than that and died in 1964. So he's very much part of that whole mid-century way of looking at things.
Okay, and the actual festivals that were actually initially done or practiced, what are the terms for them and what?
Well, see, we have these 8 festivals, right? Originally there were 4.
By 4, what type, what, when?
I'm just about to get that. I mean, first of all, you had, at 4 you had, starting with Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Autumn Equinox. Lunacy.
Yeah, Imbolc, Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lunacy, as we would say in Irish. Yours is the Scots.
Well, no, it's not. Mine's is the, to be honest with you, what Gerald Gardner would put out. Gerald was no great scholar in that sense. He would just put what he thought was a fairly popular pronunciation. And some people, the people in the group that he got around with, started to complain that that wasn't enough. So he stuck another 4 in, and that was the equinoxes and the solstices. So we then have 8.
I believe I spoke with Gene Williams. Gene Williams came up with it separate from Gardner, because Gardner was away when they actually had the other festivals.
Now that's something I didn't know, but I do know that we then end up physically with 8 festivals. And of course we also have another set of festivals, which is the full moons.
Okay, so you've got basically the 4 fire festivals of the ancient Celtic.
Yeah.
Or early Irish, early Scottish, the actual... I suppose the Welsh had similar festivals at those times.
Also the festivals as seen through a populist pair of glasses rather than what a scholar would do.
Okay, and then you're actually talking of the solstices here.
Yeah.
Which John's, which is the summer solstice.
Yeah.
That's the only fire festival, a major fire festival basically that I know of, those ones that used to be done.
Yeah, well, I mean, one remembers that Gardner's approach to history was more romantic than scholarly.
So that would be a picture in it, all right. The writings, like you were talking about dogmatic and style and the rest of it, and you're actually clarifying that Gardner himself and what his actual goals were. In his later life, he brought out a set of rules. And Doreen didn't agree with the set of rules, along with a number of others. What do you think he brought those rules out for?
Well, we know, I mean, because there was arguments in the group, and somebody had turned around and said, we need some form of rules to at least go by. You can't keep changing them. So one night he suddenly came out with this 108 original rules that he'd suddenly discovered in what he considered to be medieval English. But how authentic they are is up to each person's individuality to decide. I personally think they'll come from his head.
Now, the actual Gardner was based in which part of Britain?
Well, Gardner, first of all, when he came back into Britain, he went down to the New Forest and had a house just south of it in Christchurch. That's where he met some of the people who started off his interest in this. Before that, you remember, Gardner was involved with Aleister Crowley in the OTO, and so therefore he'd transferred from a more, I suppose, high magic style to this folk magic that these people in the New Forest had been given. Later on, he bought a house in the Isle of Man and an ex-mill, which he turned into a museum.
Just as a point, he was also a member of the Ancient Order of Hibernians when he was in Malaya.
Yeah,
which were a Freemason organisation. But coming back to Crowley, because most people who listen to this may not, the newer people may not have a knowledge of Crowley or the rest of these things. Could you expand a little bit about Aleister Crowley?
One, first of all, has to go back to the magical society of the late 19th century, the Golden Dawn, which was set up by a bunch of people, including a bloke called Mathers, in order to study the Kabbalah and many other things. He was had brought in a bloke called Aleister Crowley, whose parents had been Plymouth Brethren, who was a bit of a wild child in his youth. Aleister Crowley is highly intelligent, developed this and fell out with most of the Golden Dawn people, started his own thing, and this became known as Thelema. A lot of people found it very attractive in the 30s and 40s and joined it, but it's very much a high magic thing with sort of spirits, demons and the like, rather than a more practical folk magic thing. Gardner got involved in that, and he became quite a close friend of Crowley's before Crowley himself died. Crowley had, it is said, hoped to have Gardner as his successor leading it, but Gardner had by that time found a group in the New Forest who were dealing with this other folk magic system, and he found that more attractive, so he developed that further himself, writing a number of books, including High Magic's Aid, the novel, and Witchcraft for Today, his book on the subject.
So that's Gardner's books, or two books that are actually you're mentioning there. I know he did another book or a seminal work on the Malayan weapons.
Oh, he did a number of them.
But the actual thing about Gardner, to an extent, I'm trying to formulate these questions because some of the stuff you're saying is interesting to me.
Yeah.
I'm getting a picture of a fairly well-off man. He
had made, he started off quite well off, obviously. But
a bit of a storyteller.
Very much a person who saw life in shall we say, a narrative that was his own development rather than anything else.
And a lot of people would originally starting off with 4 festivals.
Yeah.
Because and those 4 festivals were done at times when he was in the country, because he was out of the country for 2 or 3 months a year with his health.
And he was very interested in the Middle East, so, for instance, in Greece, in North Africa, and would go there a lot as well.
So he had actually his trips and the rest of it. So a lot of the actual material that we see that has come down since that time is influenced by many, many people rather than just him. And he's an initial start. He'd be like a maverick, someone that actually came across the idea and
he was to a certain extent the catalyst.
The catalyst.
But he wasn't the only one. There were a number of others who had said that he's talking rubbish, here's what we really do. But often what they were actually doing was copying his work and then putting it out as their own.
Yeah.
It wasn't until Dorian Valiente came along that the more creative side of it became emphasised, I think.
He liked an awful lot of publicity.
Well, that's one of the things that is meant to have annoyed the people in the New Forest that he started with and why he fell out with them. He was more interested in giving away stuff that they wanted to keep quiet. The book How Magic's Aide, for instance, there's stuff in there which shocked them and which made them very angry.
Now, I'm told there was 2 ghostwriters with some of his books.
I'm not that sure about that myself.
Montalban and...
Madeline Montalban, yeah.
And then there would have been Idris Shah.
Idris Shah, yeah. Well, one of my great mentors knew Idris Shah quite well and reckoned he was quite a creative person. Madeline Montalban, I think, but I do know people who knew her. But I didn't think she was that heavily involved.
It's more like because Gardner had problems with reading and writing and the dyslexia, I think.
Gardner had, you would see from a lot of the stuff that he's left that he'd been trying to practice to improve everything.
He's trying to improve.
Not doing very well.
Not doing very well because it wasn't his skill set, this actual writing.
No.
So he's trying to get material across, and he might have a load of material, but not the actual ability to actually put it in words. Dorian Valiente was much more of a wordsmith.
She was very much a poetess, yeah.
Yeah, and she was actually a fairly good, comfortable read. It's kind of jagged to read Gardner stuff. It's jarring because it just...
You could normally tell the difference, indeed.
You can definitely tell the difference in writing styles.
But you must remember also that as it went on, she was by no means the only one. People like Pat Crowther, for instance, also came into it, who had Pat and Arnold. They had a theatrical background. They were in the theatre.
Yeah.
And so they brought the whole techniques of display and of, of acting into the Wicca itself.
Into the rituals.
Yeah, and there were others, some of which people weren't overly approving of. Ray Bone, for instance, was one that didn't seem to get too much in the way of friendship from some people. And they thought that she was maybe less appropriate for their particular social set than others.
And why would that be now?
She was a person who ran a nursing home, rather than being someone who was under a private income. But later on others came in who were much the same. I mean, when Zach Cox, for instance, came in, he was heavily involved in influencing the craft. He was no millionaire. He was quite an ordinary person, and but he did heavily influence Wicca itself in many ways.
I met his wife Jean, and she was a lovely lady. Now there used to be another person that hung around with that group at that time period. Fred
Lamont. Yeah, Fred was one of the groups. Let's put it this way: there were a number of people. Jack Braithland was his big manager, if you like. Fred was brought in around 1957, I think, and Fred became quite a confidant of Gardner, or at least that's what he would say to me. Tam tended to be a bit more pragmatic in how he viewed the craft. Him and his wife were a couple who again became quite a golden couple to some extent when he was younger. Very good at his own writing.
Okay. So he's brought out his own book.
Oh, he brought out a book called 50 Years in Wicca.
Okay.
An interesting book, but his actual writing style is, I consider, a bit sort of cramped compared with other books. But at the same time, there's plenty of material and tales in there, some of which I'm actually involved in. And there's a particular piece about a hand fasting where Fred was invoking the water, the air and the clouds, and we suddenly found a storm rushing across from the hills and ended up getting soaked. And I was the high priest of that particular hand fasting.
As a question for you. You talk about craft as a word. So is this a religion or a spiritual path?
It's both at the same time. It is whatever a person perceives. Point about it is that each person knows in their heart what it would be for them, and therefore I see it as part of a religion. I see it as part of paganism, and a group within paganism that wants to get closer to the spirit of the gods.
Okay, there's another thing that comes back to me there in a minute, because Crowley and his influence on Wicca, there have been a number of people who've written very scant claims that actually Wicca comes from the OTO and from Crowley, really, and it's not actually Gardner's idea at all, that Gardner was just an actual person that Crowley kind of ordered to bring it to the public. And what would you think of that idea?
Well, considering that both from what Fred himself had told me and from what I've read, that Crowley wanted Gardner to be the head of the actual OTO, not to bring something else in, and Gardner had gone a different way. So therefore, the changes, the differences between Wicca and the OTO are such that I could see that there would never be a complete uniting of the two ever. And the characters of the different people. Crowley being brought up in a strict Christian community, a very extreme community, who he spent most of his life rebelling against, tended to be a little bit more sort of like formal and rigid than Gardner. And the actual craft, Wicca, if you look at it, I see it to be more based on Freemasonry than, if you want to take a thing from it, than the OTO.
And why would you think it's based more like that?
Craft was an avid Freemason. Gardner was an avid Freemason, we know that. And a number of the people who he initially brought in, the men, were through Masonic connections. A lot of the things like the 3 degrees of initiation that we see are based on Masonry. And if you look at the magical weapons that they use, a lot of them also seem to be quite Masonic. Whereas Crowley's group really had its original roots in the Kabbalah, and in the Kabbalah as interpreted by the OTO, by the Golden Dawn. So there's a big difference there. We're not quite so much involved with the Kabbalah.
I know we're kind of talking, we're switched into the history of it there, but we've kind of missed a little piece as far as I'm concerned, in the sense of what is Wicca? What do you do? Is there a singular god? Is there a number of gods? What way does this work?
Essentially, the way that it's seen by a lot of people is what I would call a duotheistic. There is a goddess and a god. But that goddess and the god are in fact two aspects of the one thing, which is beyond all that goes into the realms of, if you like, the super intellect, the super ego. There are many people who also see that Wicca is a mystery religion with a series of mysteries. or in other words, things that need direct experience rather than things you can talk about, which will bring you closer to, in nature, to the gods. And through that, they will have their own gods and goddesses.
We've actually got a lot of internet these days, a lot of ways to access information. The information, lots of information, not all of it any good. Well, a majority of it is actually just regurgitated material. But throughout a lot of it, the original method of getting the idea of witchcraft across seems to have been the news of the world with its nude photographs on a Sunday.
Well, yeah.
And the actual sun with its actual, there was always something in the actual 70s, 80s and 90s with this material until they got bored of looking at Wicca. It's not exciting anymore as far as the newspapers. It's not tantalizing enough. But throughout them, there was actually a section in there about spells, and magic and, worshipping Satan and the rest of it. So, do they kiss the devil's ass?
No, they don't believe in the devil. When you go back to
that must be difficult to kiss his ass then if you don't believe in him.
It was. I mean, mainly, most people put the goddess or the female generative aspect as to the fore, with the god as, an essential part of that.
So is this a goddess religion or a god religion with a god in the background, like an altar boy?
To many people, it's what they are. The vast majority do tend to see it more as a goddess religion. Okay. Although I think that's unfair because the god is very important within the craft. So it's a duotheistic religion.
You would think equity between the actual male and the female.
Well, let's put it this way, it's practice and the theory. There should be more equity between the male and the female. But in the last few years, it's tended to turn out more towards the goddess. And as it does so, it also becomes more of a women's thing, that certain people are looking at seeing it as an alternative to a male-dominated standard religion, the Abrahamic religions of today. But that's, I think, an imposition. It's not looking at it with any depth. It's just simply, to me, it's just sloganeering.
The actual other thing I would be saying is, since there was a whole lot of spells and magic, how much spells and magic is actually, is it actually a spells and magic thing? Well, and the spells and magic in this case replacing prayers and meditations in the other religions, because it's the same thing as far as I'm concerned.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of people who look on it that way. I don't, personally. I'm less interested in the spells than I am in basically the prayers and the meditations. We do have meditations, we do have prayers, we have techniques of meditation. But many people also think that the idea of using spells as a practical way of helping others is important within the religion. It's based on those who come into it from having had an image of what witchcraft was in the medieval period, and that they would see that more as a spell thing.
Okay, so as a looking at it along the way, in the actual structure of the group, which you call a coven, or the expanded groups, the covens, when you actually get a larger group meeting, is there equality between the male and female?
There is equality, but Gardner himself said that because in his day females were less privileged than men, the men were more dominant, that there was a need to make the leader of the coven, the one who focused the group, a female. That was his opinion. More and more, each group is becoming individual, and the man is even more important than the woman at times. It depends on the individual. But in a lot of others, the female is the one who still focuses and controls the group, with the man acting as her assistant.
But there's an awful lot of logistics with forming any group, any club, as in doing it like does the actual whole group take part of that, or is there a certain amount of people that do the logistics of it, like, buying the actual foodstuffs for it, cleaning the house, for an actual event or ritual, or organising, booking taxis, whatever needs to be done, like, but you know.
If one goes back to the early days of the craft, there was very much one or two people who would do this. They would tend to do everything and people would just attend. Gardner was like that. I mean, a lot of the stuff, he had quite a small group of people who would act as executives, if you like. In the later period, it's tended to be more inclusive, in that everybody is more involved in getting involved in the organising of it and bringing stuff, and in actually even putting their own voices into discussing how the rituals and the rites would go. Whereas
it must be a difficulty if you're going to talk about a mystery, because if you talk about a mystery, it's no longer a mystery.
Well, in the sense of these rituals and rites, this isn't the mysteries. This is simply your ongoing, worship of,
like a church.
The celebration, like as in a church, it's a celebration of the, if you like, the majesty of the year and the majesty of the fertility and the rhythm of the year.
So to be thankful for what you have, basically.
To be thankful for what you have, yeah.
Is basically what you're celebrating. This is it, and that actually things will change over time. We live in a different world now than the 1950s and 60s. We have refrigeration, we have electricity. I know an awful lot of people may not think about that, but people grew a lot of their own vegetables in their own gardens. They had chickens and things like that. They even slaughtered their own animals in that time period.
And there's a lot of people, there are those in the countryside that I've met more than once, living out in some farm, who make this point. Oh, how can you possibly be real witches if you are running around being in the middle of a town? But we've got to do with what we've got to deal with.
So you've actually got that kind of feel of it, but what's your answer to that as a point then, Well,
there is one point. One of the problems with the modern world is people tend to see each other at a distance. Often they'll text rather than even phone. You don't get the character, you don't get the interpersonal richness of a face-to-face connection. Even joining it now, people will go into Facebook and see if there's anything there. So there's not the effort of actually contacting and getting to know people. And this is bad.
What about the actual reading of material? Because you're coming from a time period when people read books on witchcraft and they were hard to come by.
No, they were, and nowadays even that's much more, much easier to find.
Are people reading them, or are they just skimming?
There is an organisation called Wikipedia, which means that you can have a potted version of something, and that's it. You can make yourself an expert by reading just that. Problem is, one, it's not always accurate. Two, sometimes abbreviated descriptions are themselves a bad thing, because they cut out a lot of the spirit of the thing. So people are getting a more generalised view, often I think a more populist view of something which is in fact deeper. So I would say that there is a bad point to the internet, that the internet should never be your prime influence in the development of your own relationship with the gods.
So just as a matter of interest, what is the good that you've seen in Wicca in the last 50 years, and what is the bad?
When I started, it was very hard to get into it. I, for instance, found myself originally in it through nothing more than, I suppose, just luck. Nowadays, we're much more organised. We're much more organised in the way we train and combine things. We have, as a common thing in most cities, a thing called a moot, where all sorts of pagans can get together and a number of Wiccans can talk about, or a number of prospective Wiccans can talk about what their idea of the thing should be and how they feel they would want to join and get involved in it. And that's good, but it's also far too easy than it compared with what it used to be. It's no longer something where you have to work so hard at.
As it comes now, Wicca, there's people advertising on the internet for the last few years, become a witch, 10-week course, €500, whatever, and become a genuine witch, What do you think of that stuff?
It's phony. basically, it's like saying become an orchestral violinist in 5 weeks, and within the 5 weeks you'll be able to join an orchestra. You can't develop skills like that. One of the most important things you must do is get to know the people around you, get to know the friends, get to pick and organise a group that you like, and then basically get individual training from that group. On the other hand, there's an awful lot of these who are not only charlatans, but they're doing it for ego purposes only. They want to be the big chiefs.
So what happens when the people who've got their Wicca 101 course off of the internet and their certification and their Visa card to prove that they paid for it, turn up at an actual event?
Well, it depends on the event. Open gatherings can be for anybody, but if they think they're witches, they're not.
They're not, because they haven't gone through the training purpose that's actually... Training
and the interaction, the development of a group is each individual within that group knowing the rest. There is a thing I got told many years ago by one of my great teachers, that if you look across a circle where everybody's standing in a circle and you don't know the people completely at the other end of the circle, the thing's too big. It's not. It needs to.
It's a personal religion,
so it must be a personal relationship.
Community.
Yeah, and there's also a personal relationship with the gods, which you can only develop through knowing people and talking to them, not sort of like passing exams or reading from the internet.
So, what do you think actually Wicca, or the people in Wicca, should be aiming for? To actually improve it, to actually make it...
Well, to me, I mean, this is only a personal thing, of course. I want to see more of the mystical side, more of the relationship with the gods, more of the special interaction between your own heart and, if you like, the Godhead within. I'd like to see much more of...
kindness, compassion?
Well, there's also what we
tolerance.
Call the 8 Wiccan virtues, which are the rules that basically come from Dori Valiente, and compassion is a big thing like that. And yeah, you're right. It's a really important thing. We should be a humanist religion in the sense that we should value not only nature but the lives and existence of our fellow living beings, including human beings. And there is a tendency among some people not to do that so much.
Presently there's a whole save the planet, the kids are out there to save the planet kind of crack out there. I happen to know that you were involved with an awful lot of stuff 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah, I was involved with the anti-nuclear movement and with peace camps. It's the same thing. The only problem is you've got to have discipline to do it effectively. I mean, just running around and sort of like sitting in the middle of the high street is all very well. It'll get you on the news. But where do you go from there? How do you involve others? How do you really persuade them? And I suppose, whereas I admire the activism that they have, I also think we've got to be practical. We've got to go in for persuasion, for interaction, for telling people just why these things are important. And then also to say, well, great, lovely, how much are we generalising? And knowledge it can be a bad thing.
Okay, just as a cut in there again, because I actually happen to know you. We spoke now over the weekend. You've taught me some of the stuff you've done, as in you've taught adults, you've taught the actual people, the homeless. You've gone out and you've done things as an educated people who couldn't read and write. I worked with people with dyslexia, I worked with people with autism. That's a more practical, you need an actual, if you were to tell people how or what you did along those lines, just some of it basically, to give people a picture of where they should be going.
Well, in my case, of course, this was my job, this is professional. I was, in my later years when I went into adult education, one of the things I specialised in was diagnosing the barriers to learning and looking for techniques for overcoming these barriers to learning. By which I mean, for instance, if a person couldn't read properly, why? What was causing it? And often you'd find, for instance, that it was a social thing, that something had happened in their lives. As well as that, my own particular thing, which I found to be the most satisfying and enjoying form of teaching is what I call outreach, where I'd go out either into housing estates at one point, where the older people who would find education colleges a bit too much, a bit too confusing, could be brought up to stage in their own, with their own confidence and abilities, by having it in the local village hall or local council estate hall. And then working with different hostels and going through different homeless hostels, setting up and with a small team, and actually again building facilities where people are comfortable, where people are not put out, where they're not in a place where they feel that they have to perform, or they feel that they're being under watch all the time. That's mine. That's my own personal thing.
Okay, now applying that to coven material and teaching people, what are you looking for to actually create or help the actual person, the individual, create within themselves?
Again, it's one-to-one, interactive. If I can go back to an analogy with, say, for instance, working with people who have reading problems, I found that when you're actually assessing them, discussion, interaction, and the ability to actually allow them to express, even no matter how clumsily they could do it in their own way, what the problem is, was important. Within the craft, within the teaching of the techniques, again, it's interaction. It's not getting things through a book. It's not getting things through an article. It's going down, and maybe a small group of people, not only being taught, but discussing and developing. That often you'll find, in fact, that you can get new ideas and new insights yourself into working with that.
Okay, now you've been at it for how long?
1978 I got initiated. That's
and you're
42 years.
And so which style of, because there's different styles.
Well, I went to college in South East London. I went to Goldsmiths, and South East London is famous for the Whitecroft line of Wicca. And
Witchcraft leads from whom, or
well,
leads
it starts
where?
off from one of Gardner's priestesses, Ray Bourne, and then another woman, Madge Worthington, took over with the high priest that Ray Bourne had, Arthur Eaglin, and developed it from there. It became perhaps the most successful form of or lineage of Wicca, certainly in Europe, and probably now it's growing in America.
So my question for you is there just one or two lines?
Oh, there's many lines. I mean, it depends what you mean by a line, I suppose.
No, I'm just saying that you're actually saying basically that there was a priestesses of Gardner that actually passed on this information.
And a lot of it was, for instance, Manchester line, which comes from Pat Crowther. You've got the Wilsons up in Scotland. You've got the Clark line. Clark interestingly was a man and met Gardner through Freemasonry. So there's a number of these original...
Did Doreen Valiente have a line?
She never really did. She tended to work with people on her own way. And often she would work with people who were from different backgrounds and different lineages herself. Okay. So she never seemed to found a Valientiest line.
That's a pity.
Oh, in that way, she actually enriched many of the other lines going. For instance, she knew Madge Worthington quite well, and we'd work with her and a lot of the ideas.
I used to know a Jean, as we said, and you were talking about
Jean,
Zach and Jean, so they're actually another one of the lines, yeah.
Well, they come through from what we call the Bricket Wood, the one of the early groups of Gardner himself, and they come through from another priestess called Defo.
Okay, and that's along those lines. So as a last, because I don't want to keep you too long, and you've got to fly back, is there a last piece of thing that you would like to say?
Well, to me, it's about the deeper understanding of the gods. I'm not too worried about the magic side of it, but the idea of getting closer to to the very creative elements which exist within the universe. That's my thing of Wicca. And I do that through fun and laughter, through joy, and through compassion. Well, I want to develop that more.
Just as a matter of interest, the age groups of Wicca, do you take in children?
No.
Teenagers?
No.
young adults.
Well, the actual age limit for Wicca, we say is 18, although very few people come in that young. I mean, normally if they're coming in that young, it's usually because they're related to somebody else in the group. Otherwise, I would say people, the average start is between 23 and 33.
23
after you've had a bit of life. The goddess and the god are not interested in, since Wicca is to me a priesthood, a priestess and priesthood of the gods and the goddess, they're not interested in children. Children develop and children have their own lives. They've got their own ability to grow and learn, but we cannot stick them in something right away. We've got to give them the chance to go everywhere and anywhere.
So you want them to come to it from their own heart rather than being forced into it.
It must be from their own heart and their own experiences, but that experience must be a mature and developed experience, and children are living to develop that. Nothing, they're not there yet. So we wouldn't want. Whereas children could come and take part in some fun things. We have a thing at Imbol where we have a piñata, sort of a wren, a big papier-mâché wren. But the children, there's nothing theological. They come along with big sticks and bash the wren until it's opened, and all the sweets fall out, and then they scramble around for the sweets. It's about fun and joy and fun and laughter.
No, that's very good. I will actually leave it at that. I thank you for your interview.
And I thank you for giving me the opportunity.